Hi, I'm Annalisa.
I'm Maggie.
I'm Nicole.
And I'm Leah.
We're a team of mental health professionals from Unleashed Counseling.
Welcome to Bibliotherapy, a self-help book club podcast. Let's book it.
All right, so welcome back to our Bibliotherapy podcast on self-help books. We're just finishing up Didn't See That Coming by Rachel Hollis. I actually finished it this morning and definitely cried a little bit. I have the actual book, and I also listened to the audio, just depending on what I felt like. And when she actually reads the audiobook herself, and in that last chapter, when she's talking about the death of her brother, she like chokes up, of course, and you can hear it in the recording. It was so powerful, and I definitely cried with her.
That's right. You were doing the audiobook, right? So you were actually hearing it. That's so interesting. You were actually hearing it from her point of view. Because I'm just, reading the normal book, the physical copy of the book. So that's a little different, right? But that's really interesting. So I'm sure those parts about her brother were like kind of difficult for her to talk through, right?
Yeah, it was intense. You could hear the emotion in her voice. And also earlier, when she talks about sort of how her parents let her down, you could hear the anger in her voice too. Like she held nothing back, and it was uncomfortable reading that. Did anyone else, like, how did you feel reading that chapter?
I was just thinking about that, of like feeling that uncomfortable feeling reading that chapter, mostly because it was a perspective that I didn't really think about, like, for myself, of when it comes to having kids, because I mean, I don't have any kids of my own. I've only seen it from the perspective of seeing my parents and how like we grew up, but like that perspective of having to be strong for like your kids and trying to navigate, like, in that instance, like the loss of one of your kids, and also still being there for your surviving like kids, right? And it does feel uncomfortable, because it's almost like calling your parents out, like her parents, right? Of like, you basically abandoned me after, because I lost my brother, you lost like your son, but like I was still, X amount of years old. I think she's at 14 when he died, and like that, she was saying, like, if I looked at my kids, and like one is around that age, like I could not imagine them just not having that guide of a parent. They're not old enough. And there was also a line that she had mentioned of like, hold on, it was like a pretty like interesting perspective that like she had brought up, of like, you might try and hide this stuff, but like they're going to pick up on it. And like that, sometimes kids aren't given the credit that's due when it comes to a crisis, because they're not only going through this with you and like for the first time, but also like at 14, your emotional development's really not there. They need to see that role model. They need to see how to to figure these things out. So like reading through that chapter was uncomfortable, and like you could tell that like she was like really emotionally charged while writing it.
Yeah. Just for context, her brother tragically committed suicide in their family home as she was getting ready for school one morning. And she heard it happen in the bath, or she heard it from her bathroom, I believe. And she's talking about how she just her brain just continued telling her that it was like a stack of books falling off of a shelf, or something falling. um, and her parents had already left for work for the morning. And you can imagine the shock, because your brain is just trying to you know shut your receptors off from that fear and from that loss. And because before it even happens that something horrible happened. But again, reading through that, um and how, again, like Nicole, how you said with her anger, and how she just kept repeating, I'm like shaking right now. How she just keeps repeating how I was 14 years old. I was 14 years old. And especially going through something like that, you need your parents. But again, it's easy, it's not easy, but it's difficult to understand. But it's uh you can see both sides, right? Like the grief on either end, like being a parent and losing their child to such for such a tragic way, and still having to raise your other children when you just absolutely want to shut down. So it's like, you can see from both ends. But again, she was just a kid. And um that's kind of like one of the most important phases in, like, the adolescent life. Like, she's probably going through a lot of changes at that point and experiencing new things, and you need, like, your mom and dad at that point to talk about stuff, to go through stuff with them.
There was one part that she mentioned, like she talks out to the reader, right? And like she says, I'm positive that someone reading this is so consumed by their own pain that they've stopped caring if the people they love are in pain as well. And it kind of made me think of like when like a family goes through a tragedy, everyone goes through it very differently, even coming from the same spot, right? Because they're in different stages of life, they've experienced different things. And the thought of seeing your parents have that like perceived lack of care for you based off of their grieving process, when you're also grieving that same person, is hard, because then it also brings up the grief of what was. Like she talked about holidays, how after her brother died, that holidays were no longer the same. And I mean, I can definitely really attest to that, of with every person that I have lost in my life, something was different about, especially Christmas, right? And like thinking of different traditions that you would have as a family. And I'm Italian, so Feast of the Seven Fishes, like every year, right? Christmas Eve was a huge thing. And not to say that it's not huge for us still, but it's incredibly different than what it was when my aunt was still around and she was the one who was hosting it. So there's that point where there's certain parts of the year, you're going to still experience parts of that grief, right? That loss of somebody. And I can only imagine, as like a family that completely stopped doing traditions, that it feels like that person is no longer being recognized, right? Like there's that chapter that's ended because yes, like realistically they're no longer here, but at the same time it's wanting to preserve the family that's still there, and to also preserve their name and their memory. And it might not look the same. So for our example, Feast of the Seven Fishes, we do it at a different house. It's different people that show up. We have different recipes, and some of them are the same, but not all, right? It's not as big as it used to be. But it's still a time where we can like kind of call upon, like, oh, remember that one time when Christina, my sister, had like shrimp and she ended up like barfing before like did it even happen? And then like, my Aunt Mary was like running around with like a pot to like give her, and like it was just like a whole like thing. But like we can like think back, and then my aunt was like singing songs, basically making fun of the situation to make her laugh. But like, when would you have that time to talk about those things if you're no longer doing those traditions? So it seems like for her, she made the tradition of watching A Christmas Story to keep those memories alive for herself. Because she's right, you can't just keep thinking about the other people and how they're grieving and how that is hurting you, because then it stunts your grieving process, and it also makes it so much harder for you to find those joys in life again, and some of that peace that can come with just kind of like, okay, this is their way that they're choosing to deal with it, and I'm going to find mine.
Yeah, I think part of what she was, or part of what I took from the way that she described those 3 years following her brother's death is that she had to grieve twice, right? She had to grieve the loss of her brother, but then she also had to grieve, and it's not necessarily the loss of her parents, but maybe like the loss of what she knew as like a healthy family, or what she needed as a kid. It's certainly like she says, after she turned 17, she never went back for another holiday with her parents. But when she's writing about them, she still calls them mama and daddy, right? So I took that as like, okay, so is there still a relationship with her family? There still seems to be some kind of like respect or honoring them. And she says, what happened as a parent losing their only son, that's their story to tell. I'm not going to go there. And then she like goes on to tell her story, which is painful to listen to. And like I said, it was like, oh, this is a little uncomfortable. Like, what would it be like to be her parents reading this? And also, who cares? This is her story, so she gets to say it, right? So I'm like proud of her for owning that and putting it out there.
Yes, definitely. And again, like with these hard topics that she's talking about and that she's covering, the humor that she can still manage to fit in. It's like we talk about this all the time, that, the power of humor, the power of laughter. Laughter is the best medicine. And some of the things that she puts in there, just like this part, I literally wrote, I have an arrow and it says OMG. When she's talking about, it's at the beginning of that chapter where you show up for your kids, and you're there, you're there for the ones that you have to support. And she's talking about getting fired up, and not like fired up like we're the Rancho Carne Toros, like bring it on, and the East Compton Clovers and all that. I was dying again, because like it's so funny, it's so relatable, it's so simple to me, but like I was a cheerleader, and that was a whole different part of my life, and Bring It On was like the holy grail to being a cheerleader, and like you watched it at every weekend sleepover. I think I could still like quote that movie from beginning to end. And that was just another one of those really funny parts that provides that like comic relief that you need for these heavy chapters. Especially that one where she's talking about so much loss within a short amount of time. And like Lisa said, not a loss of her parents, but a loss of what she wanted to see in her parents and what she expected to get from them, that it was just a complete disappointment. And for me, I was fortunately very blessed with my parents. They were both there for me. My dad was a really hard worker, so my mom was more of the soccer mom, so to speak, the cheer mom. But so my dad wasn't at as many like school functions and stuff, but I was very fortunate. So for me, it's like I could not imagine, and I know my mom would say the same thing, because we talk about this all the time, like just upping and leaving your kids to fend for themselves in situations like that. So, there were so many parts of this second half that just kind of blew my mind in that way. Like, and just completely changed my perspective on things, because I could have been in that situation and grown up in that situation and gone through that. But again, to hear her firsthand point of view is like heartbreaking and gut wrenching and inspiring and everything, you know. Hey, listeners. After you're done listening, check out our awesome guide that is jacked full of ideas to practice self-care. Here's why you should grab up your free guide now. Because we love you. Because you deserve a break. Because if you continue to go at the pace you're going, you'll burn out. Because you may actually have forgotten how to do self-care. What are you waiting for? Head over to selfcaretips.org/free guide and give yourself permission to do that thing that makes you happy.
So we've like mostly sung her praises, but I gotta say I didn't agree with everything that she wrote in the second half, especially when she was talking about, I guess it was the next chapter after that one. She's still talking about showing up for your kids, but she says, if you're stressed, don't let them see that. If you need to cry, go into a room and cry, but like you have to be strong, you have to be there for your kids. And if you don't agree with me, I don't care. And I was like, okay, well, I don't agree, and it's fine that you don't care. But I was just like, man, and I'll actually go first person here and talk about myself as a parent. I want River to know that there are times when you're going to feel stress and you're going to be angry and you're going to be sad and you're going to grieve. All of the whole range of emotions are going to occur at some point in your life, and there are healthy ways to cope and there are unhealthy ways, and an unhealthy way is to hide it from the people around you, right? You've got to get that out, and the way that she's going to learn is by me and John modeling that for her, right? We can say all we want, we're here for you if you need to cry, or if you're angry, here's some ways that you can deal. But if she doesn't see us doing that, she's not going to believe that that's the right way.
I like absolutely agree with that, especially like when you said about certain things that you don't agree with. That was one part that stuck out for me too. Because I think of like, I mean, the biggest ways that kids learn is by model behavior, and if they don't have good models for what to do when there's an argument or a disagreement in a relationship, or in those kinds of situations, when they go out into the real world and start experiencing these things, they feel foreign. And it kind of makes me think back to like just my own experiences with my parents, right? Like they weren't they weren't ones to hide if they were in an argument. And it was one of those things of like, okay, like recognizing, yeah, arguments do happen, but they still love each other, right? Like they're still able to, after the whole thing is done, at some point there's resolve, right? And then we move on. If kids aren't seeing that, and kind of, skip into grief, if they don't see what grief can look like and they have their first loss, it's so hard. Like, and it almost will put that like it's wrong to feel certain ways, right? Of like, I'm crying, but mom's not, right? Like, or I want to talk about these things, but like other people, the older people in my life, they're not showing me that that's acceptable. And then it makes it harder to express, later on. So that was like one thing that I was like, okay, I understand the not burdening your kids with the stress, because I feel like that's a line that like she also kind of mentions of like, kids are not equipped to really take your stress, but they're going to try. And when that happens, that can cause a lot of undue like harm to like your kid. And you might not realize that it's harmful, but later on in life it could come out that, like, that they're not sure how to respond to certain things. So there's that line, but like at the same time, it's okay to have stress. It's how you manage the stress. And how do you learn how to manage the stress? By going through a stressful time and getting through it, by seeing people go through stressful times and seeing them get through it and getting ideas of how you can deal with it, or like later on. So I totally, I agree. I feel like that was a great talking point, for sure.
Yeah, me too. That was definitely one part that rubbed me the wrong way. I think it's a little unrealistic. I'm not even a parent, and I know, but I have parents. Well, I have a parent. I have parents, and they would not dare hide their fighting from us. Like, they're, how you said, Nicole, my parents argued all the time. And with Rachel Hollis's bravery of being so transparent, before my dad passed away, he was a really, really, really bad alcoholic for years and years and years. And that put a really bad strain on my parents' relationships. And they, both with each other and with other people. And, um, you know, they would argue all the time. And I just think it's kind of a fairy tale look at things to imagine that you wouldn't, or you'd be able to keep those kinds of things from your kids. And also, again, like, you want your kids to be able to see these things firsthand, not necessarily, to my extent, but you're absolutely right that you have to, it's the same kind of contradicts what she was saying earlier in the book, that that uh you have to acknowledge who you are and what you do and what your ticks are. And now we're talking about keeping it locked up and not expressing and go, it's just, I don't know.
I honestly think it comes from personalization in the season that she's in. Because that's one thing that I kind of had in the back of my head of, like, I know, obviously our perspectives shift when different things, like situations, happen in life, right? So I think, like, the fact that while she was writing the book, things started happening, and, like, certain chapters started to elicit certain responses. I think, yeah, like, there are some contradictory statements. And I think that also sheds light to the fact that there's a lot of contradictory stuff that happens in life, like, that make you question your response, right? Of, like, hey, I went through this situation where, I lost my brother, my parents are no longer, caring, and having that anger and that frustration. And from that, seeing such a, for lack of better words, a harsh example of what grief looked like, it kind of made it so that, in her perspective, she wants to go in the opposite direction of, I don't want my kids to see my stress. I don't want them to see me cry. I don't want that, because I don't want them to feel like they're being abandoned or they're not loved or I don't care for them just because something bad is happening. So, like, that was like something that was like I was reading it because, like, yeah, like, it is this total contradiction. I'm looking at it and I'm like, okay, so, like, we feel the feels, we talk about these things, we're open, we're honest, we're transparent, but then we're hiding when we're crying. Like, wait a second. And it felt very, like, situational the way that she had mentioned it. And then it was like, well, okay, when our situations change, our perspective changes. And, like, the ways that we are going to view how to deal with a certain situation is going to look different based off of what's going on. So yeah, that was just, like, I don't know. And hey, Rachel Hollis, if you are listening, love you. I'm not trying to say that, like, I'm not trying to call you out on any kind of shit, but
Yes.
just saying that's how it is perceived by me, the lowly counselor on this podcast.
But it also aligns with the kind of last message that she talks about, and is like, you can't control what happens in life, and the sooner you realize that, the better. And I guess that kind of aligns with the unpredictability of, things like that, where you, before you have a child and before you become a parent, you're like, oh, I'll never, I'll always show every single emotion, and they'll see the experiences, so one day they know how to, go through it themselves. But it could change, because like you said, as things change, perspectives change. But the thing is, you cannot control what you cannot change, and that's like it's a sad truth that a lot of people go through life without ever realizing that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, now I have the serenity prayer going through my head. It's like this would be the moment that we recite that. I appreciated the chapter, or actually, I think it spanned a couple of chapters where she talked about her experience adopting, as well as having her own kids, or her birth kids, and I was thinking. It is an incredibly difficult job becoming a parent, and what we think we know for baby number one suddenly doesn't work and feels completely different for baby number two. Plus, there's all these experiences in our lives that are coming down on us and changing how we think about parenting, and how we engage in family relationships. And so we all want to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma, right? We either want to move far, far away from the mistakes that our parents made, or we want to really work hard to like take the gifts they gave us, and pass those on to our own kids. And we just never know until it's over, right? Until they're grown up and gone, which of those we did well and which of them we made mistakes on. And they're going to be both, no matter what, in parenting. So yeah, I echo what you said, Nicole. It's not trying to call Rachel Hollis out. She sounds like such a lovely person and a brilliant mama. And yeah, and I learned a lot from the book. I also, did you notice that there was a chapter that like echoed Brene Brown so well, that choose joy, I think, choose joy even when life sucks. She's talking about writing her joy list. And I was like, wait a second, Brene told us to do that too. And I didn't. And I think they need to. Now they've both said to do this, it's time to do it.
I also didn't. And it's like, there's a note section in the back, so might as well make use of them. Like, I didn't make, as there's so much good advice in these books. Like, it's such good ideas for, like, I had a star next to a point of journaling, and I was like, I used to journal all the time. I used to have like, I think I have like 3 full like journaling notebooks over there on my bookshelf, like front page to back page, and I don't anymore, and I don't know why. I should do that more often, and that's why I put a star next to it. Let's see if I do that. Stay tuned. I'll keep you posted.
We have a shelf in the office full of blank notebooks and journals. Feel free to grab one.
I didn't know that. How did I not know that? But yeah, it was a good read. I think very, like you said, very similar to Brene Brown. So it was not easy to read, obviously, because of those deep parts. But good to read, because hearing someone else's experiences with that kind of stuff is like, really puts into perspective what you've gone through, what you haven't gone through, what you've been fortunate to have, and what you've been not so fortunate to lose. And but it's all part of life, and that we're all just riding the wave.
Couldn't agree more. I feel like this book kind of was a comfort in the fact of like I realized how much of a comfort it was when she started talking about laughing at funerals.
The gallows humor, yeah.
Yeah, and that I think because like her, I've been to many funerals in my life, and in each of them there was a moment where something happens and we're cracking up. Like my great uncle, he passed away a couple of years ago, and the church and the cemetery were like right near each other, but we still had to put him in a hearse to get him to the burial site. And in true fashion for our family, the hearse wouldn't start.
Oh.
And so all of us were like, so like, what do we do?
What happens now?
Yeah. So they decided to like basically cart him like down, because they still were having issues.
Yeah.
And so we're all like graveside and cracking up because we're like, this is like his last like prank that he played on the whole family of like, haha, like you thought that the hearse was gonna move. You're funny. And like it ended up working afterwards. Like they fixed the hearse. Like it was okay. It was just not starting. So we were like, all right, whatever. But it was one of those moments of, yeah, we're cracking up. And then it's like that moment of, oh, it's a funeral. Should we be laughing? But like, why not? Like, I don't know. Maybe it's because it's like a comfort thing of like remembering those funnier times that is like helpful, you know? But like, or like, you know, I think my aunt, we were watching Monty Python in the ICU. And I just remember that playing in the background. And like we were still laughing at, because there's certain parts of Monty Python you just like can't not laugh at, and like we needed something to break up what was going on. So I feel like good parts of this book kind of echoed some of that, like, you know, there's quirky parts of grief and going through pain and like that aren't necessarily always talked about. And she definitely highlighted a good amount of them, and I think she shows it in a very human way. So I do appreciate this book.
Yeah. I will recommend this to clients.
Definitely. Like I can attest as well. Like I gave my father's eulogy, and then 2 years later, or 2.5 years later, I gave my uncle's eulogy. Not on the same side. It was my mom's brother that was my uncle, but and I remember writing those eulogies and wanting to incorporate as much humor as possible, because I wanted to, it's a nice to say, it's so to say a distraction. Like, you know, it takes people's mind off of the hurt and the grief and the loss, and takes them back to the happier times. But, you know, when in a time where everybody is sad or crying, like I just wanted to make everybody laugh. So that was the main goal. And I know that's both what my dad and what my uncle would have wanted, to incorporate jokes and stuff into their, because that's what they did. They were jokers. They loved to laugh. They loved to mess around with everybody and bust everybody. And you know, it's a laughter, truly. Like I say this all the time, laughing is one of my favorite things to do. I always put that in like my bios, because it's and I can always acknowledge when I'm like, I haven't laughed this hard in so long. I love those times, you know, when you can acknowledge that.
Amen to that.
Here. Well, so I think our next book is Buy Yourself the Fucking Lilies.
Ooh, she said it too.
Right?
I'm gonna have to mark that. I'm gonna mark the explicit, check off the explicit box. No, I'm just
oh
kidding.
no,
I would have said it. I'm kidding. I would have said it too. Yes, it's over on my shelf. I'm ready for that one.
Who wrote it?
Buy Yourself the Fucking Lilies and Other Rituals to Fix Your Life, from someone who's been there. That's a long title. By Tara Schuster. Okay, Tara. It's like, have you ever seen The Office when he's like, Dunder Mifflin Paper Company? It's like an article, not a headline. Oh my god. But yes, and the cover is pretty and has lilies on it, and I think it's gonna be a good one.
I'm excited.
Me too. It's a big one though, so Make sure you
All right.
make sure you spread it out appropriately. It's kind of larger. Alrighty.
All right. Thank you.
See you next time, everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye.